August 29th, 1949. 7. Oro AM, Semipalatinsk Test Site, Kazakhstan Soviet Socialist Republic. Igor Vasilievich Kurchatov stood 10 kilometers from ground zero, his beard trembling not from the desert wind, but from the weight of 4 years of sleepless nights and Stalin's ultimatum echoing in his mind. Through thick, protective glasses, he watched technicians make final adjustments to First Lightning, the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb. The device contained 2 kilograms of plutonium-239, produced in reactors that Kurchatov had designed while knowing that failure meant not just scientific disappointment, but execution. Stalin's words from 1945 had been crystal clear. Provide us with atomic weapons in the shortest possible time. You know that Hiroshima has shaken the whole world. The equilibrium has been destroyed. Provide the bomb. It will remove a great danger from us. What Stalin hadn't said, but everyone understood, was the unspoken threat hanging over every scientist in the program. Succeed or disappear into the Gulag system forever. The story begins 3 years earlier, when Kurchatov received intelligence reports that would reshape his understanding of atomic physics. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project through Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, and Theodore Hall, providing detailed blueprints of the Fat Man plutonium implosion design. But Kurchatov faced a problem more complex than simply copying American technology. The Soviet Union lacked the industrial infrastructure, refined uranium, and precision engineering capabilities that had taken the United States nearly 4 years and $2 billion to develop. Soviet industry was still rebuilding from a war that had destroyed 710 cities and towns, killed 27 million citizens, and left the economy devastated. Kurchatov had to create an atomic bomb program from virtually nothing, using wartime rationing, pre-war equipment, and scientists who were simultaneously brilliant and terrified of making mistakes under Stalin's regime. The pressure began immediately after Hiroshima on August 20, 1945, just 14 days after the first atomic bomb destroyed a Japanese city. Stalin created the Special Committee on the Atomic Problem and appointed Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD secret police, to oversee the project. This decision sent a clear message throughout the Soviet scientific community. Atomic bomb development was not merely a scientific project, but a matter of state security, where failure could be interpreted as treason. Beria's involvement meant that every scientist, engineer, and technician working on the atomic program was under constant surveillance. Their mail was opened, their conversations recorded, their families monitored. Kurchatov later wrote in his private diary, which was discovered decades after his death, "We work not just against the laws of physics, but against the laws of fear. Every calculation must be perfect, every experiment flawless, because there are no second chances under Lavrenti Pavlovich." Kurchatov's background made him an unlikely candidate to lead such a massive undertaking. Born in 1903 in the small town of Sim in the Ural Mountains, he had originally studied physics at the Crimean University, focusing on the electrical properties of crystals, research that seemed completely unrelated to nuclear weapons. His early career involved studying the dielectric properties of Rochelle salt crystals, work that was academically respected but hardly world-changing. In the 1930s, he shifted to nuclear physics, conducting experiments on nuclear fission at the Radium Institute in Leningrad. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Kurchatov was evacuated to Kazan, where he worked on developing armor protection for ships and tanks. His selection to lead the atomic bomb program was based not on nuclear weapons expertise, which virtually no Soviet scientist possessed, but on his reputation for methodical experimental work and his ability to manage large research teams under pressure. The first major challenge Kurchatov faced was uranium. The Soviet Union had virtually no domestic uranium production in 1945. Small deposits had been identified in Central Asia and Siberia, but the mining infrastructure didn't exist. Beria solved this problem through a combination of geological surveys and forced labor. Uranium mines were opened in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and later in occupied East Germany and Czechoslovakia, using a workforce consisting largely of German prisoners of war and Soviet political prisoners. These workers, lacking proper safety equipment or radiation protection, mined uranium ore under conditions that resulted in massive radiation exposure. Medical records from the period, declassified in the 1990s, show that uranium miners in this era had cancer rates nearly 800% higher than the general population. Kurchatov was aware of these human costs, writing in a 1947 letter to a colleague, "We purchase each kilogram of uranium with blood, but we purchase the survival of our country as well." The second challenge was plutonium production. The intelligence from Klaus Fuchs had provided detailed information about plutonium reactor design, but building an actual reactor required precision engineering capabilities that Soviet industry struggled to provide. Kurchatov designed the first Soviet plutonium production reactor, designated A1, based heavily on the American Hanford reactor design. But Soviet manufacturing tolerances were looser than American standards. Soviet aluminum contained more impurities, and Soviet graphite had higher neutron absorption. Each of these seemingly minor differences threatened to make the reactor inoperable. Kurchatov spent months calculating neutron cross-sections and testing materials, working 18-hour days while living on a diet consisting mainly of black bread, tea, and whatever vegetables could be grown in the reactor site's gardens. Construction of the A1 reactor began in early 1946 near the closed city of Kishtim in the Ural Mountains. The site, later designated Chelyabinsk 40 and now known as Ozersk, was built using a workforce of approximately 70 Tlazolozern people, including prisoners, soldiers, and volunteer workers attracted by promises of higher rations and better living conditions. The reactor itself was a massive structure requiring 450 tons of metallic uranium, 500 tons of uranium oxide, and 500 tons of graphite. Soviet industry struggled to produce these materials with sufficient purity. The metallic uranium contained traces of boron and cadmium that absorbed neutrons, threatening to prevent the chain reaction from sustaining itself. Kurchatov personally supervised the purification process, often working directly with radioactive materials using minimal protection, a practice that would later contribute to his early death from radiation-induced illness. Throughout 1946 and 1947, Kurchatov faced constant pressure from Beria and Stalin. Monthly progress reports were required, and any delay in the schedule was interpreted as potential sabotage. Several scientists working on the project were arrested on charges of bourgeois cosmopolitanism, a euphemism for suspected disloyalty to the Soviet state. These arrests served as warnings to the remaining scientists that scientific disagreement or technical problems could be reinterpreted as political crimes. Kurchatov learned to present setbacks as temporary obstacles rather than fundamental problems, carefully phrasing technical reports to avoid language that might be interpreted as defeatist. In one incident, when uranium contamination delayed reactor startup by 3 weeks, Kurchatov reported to Beria that the delay was necessary for optimizing safety parameters, rather than admitting that poor quality control had compromised the uranium supply. If you want to discover how Kurchatov transformed the Soviet Union from technological dependence to nuclear superpower status through innovation under unimaginable pressure, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. The A1 reactor achieved its first sustained chain reaction on December 25, 1946, making the Soviet Union only the second country to successfully operate a nuclear reactor. But achieving criticality was only the beginning. The reactor needed to operate continuously for months to produce enough plutonium for a single bomb. Soviet reactor operators, working with minimal training and inadequate safety procedures, learned nuclear reactor operation through trial and error. Radiation monitoring equipment was primitive, consisting mainly of Geiger counters that provided only crude measurements of radiation exposure. Workers routinely received radiation doses that would be considered lethal by modern standards. Medical personnel at the site recorded symptoms of radiation sickness among reactor operators, but these health effects were classified as state secrets, and medical treatment focused on keeping workers functional rather than protecting their long-term health. The plutonium production process itself required chemical separation techniques that Soviet chemists had never attempted on an industrial scale. Intelligence from the Manhattan Project provided general information about the Purex chemical separation process, but translating laboratory procedures into industrial-scale operations required months of experimentation. Soviet chemical engineers, working with limited supplies of specialized equipment and chemicals, built separation facilities using improvised techniques and locally manufactured equipment. The chemical separation process involved concentrated nitric acid, tributyl phosphate, and other highly corrosive chemicals that destroyed equipment and contaminated workers. Early separation attempts produced plutonium with unacceptable levels of impurities, forcing Kurchatov to redesign the entire chemical process while maintaining the accelerated production schedule demanded by Stalin. During this period, Kurchatov also supervised development of the bomb's implosion mechanism. The Fat Man design required precise timing of explosive charges to compress plutonium to critical density within microseconds. Soviet explosives technology, developed primarily for artillery shells and anti-tank weapons, lacked the precision timing required for nuclear weapons. Kurchatov worked closely with explosives expert Yakov Zeldovich to develop new detonator designs and explosive formulations. This work required hundreds of test explosions using conventional high explosives, each test carefully monitored to measure compression timing and uniformity. Soviet high-speed photography equipment, borrowed from artillery research programs, was barely adequate for measuring events occurring in microseconds. Test failures were common, and each failure consumed weeks of preparation time and scarce explosive materials. By early 1948, Kurchatov's team had produced enough weapons-grade plutonium for a single bomb, but the weapon design remained unproven. Unlike the American program, which had tested the plutonium implosion design at Trinity before using it at Nagasaki, the Soviet program lacked resources for a full-scale test. Stalin had made clear that materials should not be wasted on testing when they could be used for operational weapons. This decision placed enormous pressure on Kurchatov to ensure that the first Soviet atomic bomb would work perfectly without any experimental verification. Kurchatov compensated by conducting hundreds of scaled-down tests using conventional explosives and plutonium simulants, but he knew that certain aspects of nuclear weapon physics could only be verified through full-scale nuclear testing. How many of you have grandparents or great-grandparents who lived through the early Cold War and felt the terror of potential nuclear annihilation? These stories of scientific achievement under political pressure are disappearing from memory. Leave a comment right now saying just, "Science requires courage." When you comment, you're not just sharing your thoughts. You're preserving the memory of scientists who risked everything for knowledge. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. The decision to proceed with nuclear testing came in early 1949, after American President Harry Truman announced that the Soviet Union probably possessed atomic weapons capabilities. Stalin interpreted this announcement as evidence that American intelligence had detected Soviet nuclear progress, making further secrecy pointless. The test was scheduled for August 29, 1949, at a site in the Kazakhstan desert chosen for its remote location and favorable wind patterns. Preparation for the test required constructing an entire temporary city in the desert, including housing for 10 zero personnel, laboratories, measurement equipment, and communication systems. Soviet logistics, still recovering from wartime destruction, struggled to transport the necessary equipment and supplies across 1 liroco kilometers of desert and steppe. The weapon itself, designated First Lightning internally and Joe 1 by American intelligence, was a plutonium implosion device containing 2 kilograms of plutonium surrounded by 32 precisely shaped explosive charges. The device weighed approximately 600 kilograms and measured 15 meters in diameter, significantly larger and heavier than contemporary American designs due to Soviet manufacturing limitations and conservative engineering margins. Soviet metallurgy could not produce the precision components used in American weapons, forcing Kurchatov's team to compensate with larger, less efficient designs. The explosive charges were manufactured using techniques adapted from artillery production, and the detonation timing system used vacuum tubes and mechanical switches rather than the electronic systems used in American weapons. Measurement of the explosion required instrumentation that Soviet scientists had to develop specifically for nuclear testing. Seismic measurements, radiation detection, blast pressure monitoring, and high-speed photography all required equipment that existed nowhere in the Soviet Union. Kurchatov's team adapted earthquake detection equipment for measuring seismic signals, modified artillery range-finding equipment for blast pressure measurements, and improvised radiation detection systems using laboratory Geiger counters. The high-speed photography system, crucial for documenting the explosion's early phases, was assembled from aircraft cameras and artillery timing equipment. These improvised systems provided only crude measurements compared to American testing instrumentation, but they were sufficient to confirm weapon performance and measure yield. The test itself was conducted with minimal safety precautions by modern standards. Personnel were evacuated to a distance of 10 kilometers, and radiation exposure limits were based on wartime guidelines rather than peacetime safety standards. Kurchatov and senior scientists observed the test from a reinforced bunker, but many technicians and support personnel were positioned much closer to ground zero. Wind direction was monitored to avoid contaminating populated areas, but no provisions were made for evacuating local nomadic populations who might be affected by radioactive fallout. Environmental monitoring consisted mainly of collecting soil and vegetation samples after the test, with little real-time monitoring of radiation levels during the explosion. At 7:00 a.m. on August 29, 1949, the bomb detonated with a yield of approximately 22 kilotons, slightly more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Nagasaki. The explosion created a fireball reaching temperatures of 100 million degrees Celsius, instantly vaporizing the 37-meter steel tower holding the weapon and creating a mushroom cloud that rose to an altitude of 12 kilometers. Seismic stations around the world detected the explosion, and American aircraft flying along the Soviet border collected atmospheric samples containing radioactive debris that confirmed the nuclear nature of the test. For Kurchatov, watching from the observation bunker, the successful test represented not just scientific achievement, but survival, his own, his team's, and possibly his country's. The immediate aftermath of the test revealed both the achievement and the cost of the Soviet nuclear program. While the weapon had performed as designed, proving that Soviet scientists could match American nuclear capabilities, the human and environmental costs had been enormous. Workers at uranium mines and plutonium production facilities had been exposed to radiation levels that would cause widespread cancer and premature death. Environmental contamination from the weapons production complex would persist for decades, affecting local populations who were never informed of the health risks. The test site itself remained contaminated, but this information was classified, and the affected areas were simply declared off-limits to civilian populations. Stalin's reaction to the successful test was characteristic: immediate demands for increased weapons production. Within days of the test, he ordered the construction of additional plutonium reactors and expanded uranium mining operations. The success had not reduced pressure on Kurchatov and his team, but had instead raised expectations for rapid deployment of a Soviet nuclear arsenal. Stalin wanted not just atomic bombs, but hydrogen bombs, tactical nuclear weapons, and nuclear-powered submarines. Each new requirement placed additional demands on Soviet scientists who were already working at the limits of their capabilities and their country's technological infrastructure. The Soviet nuclear program continued to expand throughout the 1950s, but always under the shadow of political pressure that had characterized the original atomic bomb project. Scientists worked with the knowledge that technical failures could be interpreted as political crimes, that innovative approaches might be criticized as foreign influence, and that success would only lead to more ambitious and dangerous assignments. This environment produced remarkable scientific achievements, but at a human cost that was hidden from the world for decades. Kurchatov himself continued to lead Soviet nuclear development until his death in 1960, supervising the development of hydrogen bombs, nuclear submarines, and the first Soviet nuclear power plant. But the radiation exposure he had received during the early years of the atomic program contributed to heart problems and premature aging that ultimately killed him at age 57. His death was attributed to natural causes in official announcements, but medical records suggest that radiation-induced illness was a significant factor. Many other scientists who had worked on the early atomic program died prematurely from cancers and other illnesses associated with radiation exposure. The legacy of Kurchatov's achievement extends far beyond nuclear weapons technology. The Soviet nuclear program demonstrated that advanced technology could be developed under authoritarian political systems, but only at enormous human and environmental costs. The scientific methods and engineering techniques developed for nuclear weapons production were later applied to peaceful nuclear power generation, medical radioisotope production, and scientific research. The Kurchatov Institute, named in his honor, became one of the world's leading nuclear research centers and continues to conduct cutting-edge research in nuclear physics and fusion energy. The environmental legacy of the early Soviet nuclear program was more problematic. The Mayak plutonium production facility, where much of the plutonium for early Soviet weapons was produced, experienced multiple serious accidents that contaminated vast areas of the Ural Mountains region. The 1957 Kishtim disaster, caused by an explosion in a radioactive waste storage tank, contaminated an area of 20,000 square kilometers and forced the evacuation of 10,000 people. This accident was kept secret for decades, and affected populations received no compensation or adequate medical care. The full extent of environmental contamination from early Soviet nuclear activities is still being discovered as previously classified areas are opened to scientific investigation. The human cost of the Soviet atomic program included not only radiation exposure among workers, but also the broader social consequences of the secretive, authoritarian approach to technological development. Entire cities were built in secret to support nuclear weapons production, and their populations lived under constant surveillance and strict controls on movement and communication. Families of nuclear workers were required to maintain security clearances and were subject to investigation for any suspected political disloyalty. Children growing up in these closed cities were educated in special schools designed to produce future generations of nuclear scientists and engineers, but they were also isolated from the broader society and subjected to intensive political indoctrination. The technical achievements of Kurchatov and his team were remarkable by any standard. Starting with minimal infrastructure and working under impossible political pressure, they successfully developed nuclear weapons, nuclear reactors, and supporting technologies that established the Soviet Union as a nuclear superpower. Their work laid the foundation for all subsequent Soviet nuclear technology, including nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered spacecraft, and nuclear power plants that continue to operate today. The scientific methods and engineering approaches they developed influenced nuclear programs throughout the world and contributed to the global spread of nuclear technology. The broader historical significance of the Soviet atomic program lies in its demonstration that scientific progress can occur under political systems that prioritize state power over individual welfare. Kurchatov and his colleagues achieved remarkable technical success while working under conditions that included constant surveillance, threats of imprisonment or execution for failure, and limited access to information and materials. Their experience shows both the potential and the limitations of authoritarian approaches to technological development. Rapid progress is possible when entire societies are mobilized around specific goals, but the human and environmental costs can be devastating. Modern nuclear programs, both military and civilian, continue to grapple with the legacy of early nuclear development. The safety culture and environmental protection measures that are now considered essential parts of nuclear technology were largely absent from the early Soviet program, and the consequences of that absence continue to affect populations and environments decades later. Contemporary nuclear policy debates often reference the early Soviet experience as an example of how not to develop nuclear technology, emphasizing the importance of transparency, environmental protection, and public participation in nuclear decision-making. For Kurchatov personally, the successful development of Soviet nuclear weapons represented both triumph and tragedy. He had achieved his goal of providing the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons capability and had established himself as one of the world's leading nuclear scientists. But he had also participated in the creation of weapons of unprecedented destructive power, had overseen programs that caused massive human suffering through radiation exposure, and had worked within a political system that valued technological achievement over human welfare. His private writings, discovered after his death, reveal a man who was proud of his scientific achievements, but troubled by their implications for humanity. The story of Igor Kurchatov and the Soviet atomic bomb illustrates the complex relationship between science and politics in the modern world. Scientific progress requires resources, organization, and social support that can only be provided by political systems. But political involvement in science can distort research priorities and compromise scientific integrity. The early nuclear age was characterized by the subordination of scientific considerations to political and military goals, with consequences that continue to influence nuclear policy today. Kurchatov's experience shows both the potential for remarkable scientific achievement under political pressure and the human costs of that pressure. In the decades since the first Soviet atomic test, nuclear weapons have become symbols of national power and technological achievement, but also of the potential for human self-destruction. The scientists who developed these weapons, including Kurchatov, understood the destructive potential of their creations, but believed that nuclear weapons were necessary for their country's survival in a hostile world. Their work created the foundation for the Cold War nuclear standoff that dominated international relations for decades and continues to influence global politics today. The technical legacy of the Soviet nuclear program extends far beyond weapons technology. Nuclear reactors developed for plutonium production were adapted for electric power generation, providing a significant portion of the Soviet Union's electricity and establishing the foundation for the global nuclear power industry. Medical applications of radioactive isotopes, originally developed as byproducts of weapons production, revolutionized cancer treatment and medical diagnostics. Scientific research techniques developed for nuclear weapons programs contributed to advances in materials science, chemistry, and physics that benefited numerous other fields. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day, stories about scientists who broke rules to save lives, pilots who defied the impossible, soldiers who changed wars with courage and creativity. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States? United Kingdom? Russia? Germany? Canada? Australia? Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Cold War or nuclear programs. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Igor Kurchatov doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Educational note. This content combines documented historical facts about the Soviet atomic bomb program with educational interpretation for entertainment purposes. While the core events, dates, and technical details are historically accurate, some personal interactions and internal thoughts have been reconstructed from available historical records and memoirs to create a compelling narrative.